Welcome to this compilation of profound and contemplative sci-fi short stories. I'll be narrating Star Mother by Robert F. Young, The Most Sentimental Man by Evelyn E. Smith, The Big Engine by Fritz Leiber, and Hang Head Vandal by Mark Clifton. If you enjoy this kind of thing, there are hundreds more short stories as well as compilations like this, full novels and mini anthologies on this channel, and even more on my Substack, link to that in the description. And why not check out some of the modern novels I've narrated, like Lords of Conquest, Iron Raven by Nick Mayhew, and Control Spark by Simon Carr. All that linked in the description as well. But for now, let's get to the stories, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. Star Mother by Robert F. Young, narrated by William Skye. That night, her son was the first star. She stood motionless in the garden, one hand pressed against her heart, watching him rise above the fields where he had played as a boy, where he had worked as a young man, and she wondered whether he was thinking of those fields now, whether he was thinking of her standing alone in the April night with her memories, whether he was thinking of the verandahed house behind her with its empty rooms and silent halls that once upon a time had been his birthplace. Higher still and higher he rose in the southern sky, and then, when he had reached his zenith, he dropped swiftly down past the dark edge of the earth and disappeared from sight. A boy grown up too soon, riding round and round the world on a celestial carousel, encased in an airtight metal capsule in an airtight metal chariot. Why don't they leave the stars alone, she thought. Why don't they leave the stars to God? The General's second telegram came early the next morning. Explorer 12 doing splendidly. Expect to bring your son down sometime tomorrow. She went about her work as usual, collecting the eggs and allocating them in their cardboard boxes, then setting off in the station wagon on her Tuesday morning run. She had expected a deluge of questions from her customers. She was not disappointed. "Is Terry really way up there all alone, Martha?" "Aren't you scared, Martha?" "Oh, I do hope they can get him back down all right, Martha." She supposed it must have given them quite a turn to have their egg woman change into a star mother overnight. She hadn't expected the TV interview, though, and she would have avoided it if it had been politely possible. But what could she do when the line of cars and trucks pulled into the drive and the technicians got out and started setting up their equipment in the backyard? What could she say when the suave young man came up to her and said, "We want you to know that we're all very proud of your boy up there, ma'am, and we hope you'll do us the honour of answering a few questions." Most of the questions concerned Terry, as was fitting. From the way the suave young man asked them, though, she got the impression that he was trying to prove that her son was just like any other average American boy, and such just didn't happen to be the case. But whenever she opened her mouth to mention, say, how he used to study till all hours of the night, or how difficult it had been for him to make friends because of his shyness, or the fact that he had never gone out for football, whenever she started to mention any of these things, the suave young man was in great haste to interrupt her and to twist her words by re-questioning into a different meaning altogether, till Terry's behaviour pattern seemed to coincide with the behaviour pattern which the suave young man apparently considered the norm, but which, if followed, Martha was sure, would produce not young men bent on exploring space, but young men bent on exploring trivia. A few of the questions concerned herself. Was Terry her only child? Yes. What had happened to her husband? He was killed in the Korean War. What did she think of the new law granting star mothers top priority on any and all information relating to their sons? "I think it's a fine law. It's too bad they couldn't have shown similar humanity toward the war mothers of World War II. It was late in the afternoon by the time the TV crew got everything repacked into their cars and trucks and made their departure. Martha fixed herself a light supper, then donned an old suede jacket of Terry's and went out into the garden to wait for the sun to go down. According to the timetable the General had outlined in his first telegram, Terry's first Tuesday night passage wasn't due to occur till 9:05. But it seemed only right that she should be outside when the stars started to come out. Presently they did, and she watched them wink on one by one in the deepening darkness of the sky. She'd never been much of a one for the stars. Most of her life she'd been much too busy on Earth to bother with things celestial. She could remember when she was younger and Bill was courting her, looking up at the moon sometimes, and once in a while when a star fell, making a wish. But this was different. It was different now because she had a personal interest in the sky, a new affinity with its myriad inhabitants. And how bright they became when you kept looking at them! They seemed to come alive almost, pulsing brilliantly down out of the blackness of the night. And they were different colours too, she noticed with a start. Some of them were blue and some were red, others were yellow, green, orange. It grew cold in the April garden, and she could see her breath. There was a strange crispness, a strange clarity about the night that she had never known before. She glanced at her watch, was astonished to see that the hands indicated 2 minutes after 9. Where had the time gone? Tremulously she faced the southern horizon, and saw her Terry appear in his shining chariot, riding up the star-pebbled path of his orbit, a star in his own right, dropping swiftly now, down, down, and out of sight beyond the dark wheeling mass of the earth. She took a deep, proud breath, realized that she was wildly waving her hand, and let it fall slowly to her side. Make a wish, she thought, like a little girl, and she wished him pleasant dreams and a safe return, and wrapped the wish in all her love and cast it starward. Sometime tomorrow, the General's telegram had said. That meant sometime today. She rose with the sun and fed the chickens, fixed and ate her breakfast, collected the eggs, and put them in their cardboard boxes, then started out on her Wednesday morning run. My land, Martha, I don't see how you stand it with him way up there. Doesn't it get on your nerves? Yes, it does. Martha, when are they bringing him back down? Today. It must be wonderful being a star mother, Martha. Yes, it is, in a way. Wonderful and terrible. If only he can last it out for a few more hours, she thought. If only they can bring him down safe and sound. Then the vigil will be over, and some other mother can take over the awesome responsibility of having a son become a star. If only. The General's third telegram arrived that afternoon. Regret to inform you that meteorite impact on satellite hull severely damaged capsule detachment mechanism, making ejection impossible. Will make every effort to find another means of accomplishing your son's return. Terry! See the little boy playing beneath the maple tree, moving his tiny cars up and down the tiny streets of his make-believe village. The little boy, his fuzz of hair gold in the sunlight, his cherub cheeks pink in the summer wind. Terry! Up the lane the blue-denimed young man walks, swinging his thin, tanned arms, his long legs making near grown-up strides over the sun-seared grass. The sky blue and bright behind him, the song of cicada rising and falling in the hazy September air. Terry. Probably won't get a chance to write you again before takeoff, but don't worry, Ma. The Explorer 12 is the greatest bird they ever built. Nothing short of a direct meteorite hit can hurt it, and the odds are 1,000,000 to 1. Why don't they leave the stars alone? Why don't they leave the stars to God? The afternoon shadows lengthened on the lawn, and the sun grew red and swollen over the western hills. Martha fixed supper, tried to eat, and couldn't. After a while, when the light began to fade, she slipped into Terry's jacket and went outside. Slowly the sky darkened and the stars began to appear. At length her star appeared, but its swift passage blurred before her eyes. Tires crunched on the gravel then, and headlights washed the darkness from the drive. A car door slammed. Martha did not move. Please, God, she thought, let it be Terry. even though she knew that it couldn't possibly be Terry. Footsteps sounded behind her, paused. Someone coughed softly. She turned then. "Good evening, ma'am." She saw the circlet of stars on the grey epaulette. She saw the stern, handsome face. She saw the dark, tired eyes. And she knew. Even before he spoke again, she knew. "The same meteorite that damaged the ejection mechanism, ma'am. It penetrated the capsule, too. We didn't find out till just a while ago, but there was nothing we could have done anyway. Are you all right, ma'am?" "Yes, I'm all right." "I wanted to express my regrets personally. I know how you must feel." "It's all right." "We will, of course, make every effort to bring back his remains so that he can have a fitting burial on Earth." "No," she said. "I beg your pardon, ma'am?" She raised her eyes to the patch of sky where her son had passed in his shining metal sarcophagus. Sirius blossomed there, blue-white and beautiful. She raised her eyes still higher and beheld the vast parterre of Orion with its central motif of vivid forget-me-nots, its far-flung blooms of Betelgeuse and Rigel, of Bellatrix and Saiph. And higher yet, and there flamed the exquisite flower-beds of Taurus and Gemini, there burgeoned the riotous wreath of the Crab, there lay the pulsing petals of the Pleiades, and down the ecliptic garden path, wafted by a stellar breeze, drifted the ochre rose of Mars. "No," she said again. The general had raised his eyes too. Now slowly he lowered them. "I think I understand, ma'am, and I'm glad that's the way you want it. The stars are beautiful tonight, aren't they?" "More beautiful than they've ever been," she said. After the general had gone, she looked up once more at the vast and variegated garden of the sky where her son lay buried. Then she turned and walked slowly back to the memoried house. The Most Sentimental Man by Evelyn E. Smith. Narrated by William Skye. Once these irritating farewells were over with, he could begin to live as he wished and as he dreamed. Johnson went to see the others off at Idlewild. He knew they'd expect him to, and since it would be the last conventional gesture he'd have to make, he might as well conform to their notions of what was right and proper. For the past few centuries the climate had been getting hotter. Now, even though it was not yet June, the day was uncomfortably warm. The sun's rays glinting off the bright metal flanks of the ship dazzled his eyes, and perspiration made his shirt stick to his shoulder blades beneath a jacket that the formality of the occasion had required. He wished Clifford would hurry up and get the leave-taking over with. But even though Clifford was undoubtedly even more anxious than he to finish with all the ceremony and take off, he wasn't the kind of man to let inclination influence his actions. "Sure you won't change your mind and come with us?" Johnson shook his head. The young man looked at him, hatred for the older man's complication of what should have been a simple departure showing through the pellicule of politeness. He was young, for since this trip had only slight historical importance and none of any other kind, the authorities had felt a junior officer entirely sufficient. It was clear, however, that Clifford attributed his commandership to his merits, and he was very conscious of his great responsibility. "We have plenty of room on the ship," he persisted. "There weren't many left to go. We could take you easily enough, you know." Johnson made a negative sign again. The rays of the sun beating full upon his head made apparent the grey that usually blended into the still thick blonde hair. Yet, though past youth, he was far from being an old man. "I've made my decision," he said, remembering that anger now was pointless. If you're just too proud to change your mind," the young commander said, less certainly, "I'm sure everyone will understand if... Johnson smiled. "No, it's just that I want to stay, that's all." But the commander's clear blue eyes were still baffled, uneasy, as though he felt he had not done the utmost that duty, not duty to the service but to humanity, required. That was the trouble with people, Johnson thought. When they were most well-meaning, they became most troublesome. Clifford lowered his voice to an appropriately funeral hush, as a fresh thought obviously struck him. I know, of course, that your loved ones are buried here, and perhaps you feel it's your duty to stay with them? At this, Johnson almost forgot that anger no longer had any validity. By loved ones, Clifford undoubtedly had meant Eleanor and Paul. It was true that Johnson had had a certain affection for his wife and son when they were alive. Now that they were dead, they represented an episode in his life that had not perhaps been unpleasant, but was certainly over and done with now. Did Clifford think that was his reason for remaining? Why, he must believe Johnson to be the most sentimental man on earth. And come to think of it, Johnson said to himself, amused, I am, or soon will be, just that. The commander was still unconsciously pursuing the same train of thought. It does seem incredible, he said in a burst of boyish candour that did not become him, for he was not that young, that you'd want to stay alone on a whole planet. I mean to say, entirely alone. There'll never be another ship, you know, at least not in your lifetime. Johnson knew what the other man was thinking. If there'd been a woman with Johnson now, Clifford might have been able to understand a little better how the other could stick by his decision. Johnson wriggled as sweat oozed stickily down his back. For God's sake, he said silently, take your silly ship and get the hell off my planet. Aloud, he said, It's a good planet, a little worn out, but still in pretty good shape. Pity you can't trade in an old world like an old car, isn't it? If it weren't so damned far from the centre of things, the young man replied, defensively assuming the burden of all civilization, we wouldn't abandon it. After all, we hate leaving the world on which we originated. But it's a long haul to Alpha Centauri, you know that, and a tremendously expensive one. Keeping up this place solely out of sentiment would be sheer waste. The people would never stand for the tax burden. A costly museum, yes, Johnson agreed. How much longer were these dismal farewells going to continue? How much longer would the young man still feel the need to justify himself? If only there were others fool enough. If only there were others with you. But even if anybody else would be willing to cut himself off entirely from the rest of the civilized universe, the Earth won't support enough of a population to keep it running. Not according to our present living standards, anyway. Most of its resources are gone, you know. Hardly any coal or oil left, and that's not worth digging for when there are better and cheaper fuels in the system. He was virtually quoting from the Colonial Officer's Manual. Were there any people left able to think for themselves, Johnson wondered. Had there ever been? Had he thought for himself in making his decision, or was he merely clinging to a childish dream that all men had had and lost? With man gone, Earth will replenish herself, he said aloud. First the vegetation would begin to grow thick. Already it had released itself from the restraint of cultivation. Soon it would be spreading out over the continent, overrunning the cities with delicately persistent green tendrils. Some the harsh winters would kill, but others would live on and would multiply. Vines would twist themselves about the tall buildings and tenderly, passionately squeeze them to death, eventually send them tumbling down. And then the trees would rear themselves in their places. The swamps that man had filled in would begin to reappear one by one as the land sank back to a pristine state. The sea would go on changing her boundaries with no dikes to stop her. Volcanoes would heave up the land into different configurations. The heat would increase until it grew unbearable, only there would be no one, no human anyway, to bear it. Year after year the leaves would wither and fall and decay. Rock would cover them, and some day, billions of years thence, there would be coal and oil, and nobody to want them. Very likely Earth will replenish herself, the commander agreed, but not in your time or your children's time. That is, not in my children's time, he added hastily. The handful of men lined up in a row before the airlock shuffled their feet and allowed their muttering to become a few decibels louder. Clifford looked at his wrist chronometer. Obviously he was no less anxious than the crew to be off, but for the sake of his conscience, he must make a last try. Damn your conscience, Johnson thought. I hope that for this you feel guilty as hell, that you wake up nights in a cold sweat remembering that you left one man alone on the planet you and your kind discarded. Not that I don't want to stay, mind you, but that I want you to suffer the way you're making me suffer now, having to listen to your platitudes. The commander suddenly stopped paraphrasing the manual. Camping out's fun for a week or two, you know, but it's different when it's for a lifetime. Johnson's fingers curled in his palms. He was even angrier now that the commander had struck so close to home. Camping out. Was that all he was doing? Fulfilling childhood desires, nothing more? Fortunately, Clifford didn't realize that he had scored, and scuttled back to the shelter of the manual. Perhaps you don't know enough about the new system in Alpha Centauri, he said, a trifle wildly. It has 2 suns surrounded by 3 planets, Thalia, Aglaia, and Euphrosyne. Each of these planets is slightly smaller than Earth, so that the decrease in gravity is just great enough to be pleasant, without being so marked as to be inconvenient. The atmosphere is almost exactly like that of Earth's, except that it contains several beneficial elements which are absent here, and the climate is more temperate. Owing to the fact that the planets are partially shielded from the suns by cloud layers, the temperature, except immediately at the poles and the equators, where it is slightly more extreme, is always equable, resembling that of Southern California. Sounds charming, said Johnson. I too have read the Colonial Office handouts. I wonder what the people who wrote them will do now that there's no longer any necessity for attracting colonists. Everybody's already up in Alpha Centauri. Oh well, there'll be other systems to conquer and colonize. The word conquer is hardly correct, the commander said stiffly, since not one of the 3 planets had any indigenous life forms that was intelligent. Or life forms that you recognized as intelligent, Johnson suggested gently. Although why should there be such a premium placed on intelligence, he wondered. Was intelligence the sole criterion on which the right to life and to freedom should be based? The commander frowned and looked at his chronometer again. Well, he finally said, since you feel that way, and you're sure you've quite made up your mind, my men are anxious to go. Of course they are, Johnson said, managing to convey just the right amount of reproach. Clifford flushed and started to walk away. I'll stand out of the way of your jets, Johnson called after him. It would be so anticlimactic to have me burned to a crisp after all this. Bon voyage. There was no reply. Johnson watched the silver vessel shoot up into the sky and thought, now is the time for me to feel a pang, or even a twinge, but I don't at all. I feel relieved, in fact, but that's probably the result of getting rid of that fool Clifford. He crossed the field briskly, pulling off his jacket and discarding his tie as he went. His ground car remained where he had parked it, in an area clearly marked no parking. They'd left him an old car that wasn't worth shipping to the stars. How long it would last was anybody's guess. The government hadn't been deliberately illiberal in leaving him such a shabby vehicle. If there had been any way to ensure a continuing supply of fuel, they would probably have left him a reasonably good one. But since only a little could be left, allowing him a good car would have been simply an example of conspicuous waste, and the government had always preferred its waste to be inconspicuous. He drove slowly through the broad boulevards of Long Island, savouring the loneliness. New York as a residential area had been a ghost town for years, since the greater part of its citizens had been among the first to emigrate to the stars. However, since it was the capital of the world, and most of the interstellar ships, particularly the last few, had taken off from its spaceports, it had been kept up as an official embarkation centre. Thus, paradoxically, it was the last city to be completely evacuated, and so, although the massive but jerry-built apartment houses that lined the streets were already crumbling, the roads had been kept in fairly good shape and were hardly cracked at all. Still, here and there the green was pushing its way up in unlikely places. A few more of New York's tropical summers, and Long Island would soon become a wilderness. The streets were empty, except for the cats sunning themselves on long abandoned doorsteps or padding about on obscure errands of their own. Perhaps their numbers had not increased since humanity had left the city to them, but there certainly seemed to be more, striped and solid, black and grey and white and tawny, accepting their citizenship with equanimity. They paid no attention to Johnson. They had long since dissociated themselves from a humanity that had not concerned itself greatly over their welfare. On the other hand, neither he nor the surface car appeared to startle them. The old ones had seen such before, and to kittens the very fact of existence is the ultimate surprise. The Queensborough Bridge was deadly silent. It was completely empty except for a calico cat moving purposefully toward Manhattan. The structure needed a coat of paint, Johnson thought vaguely, but of course it would never get one. Still, even uncared for, the bridges should outlast him. There would be no heavy traffic to weaken them. Just in case of unforeseeable catastrophe, however, he didn't want to be trapped on an island, even Manhattan Island. He had remembered to provide himself with a rowboat. A motorboat would have been preferable, but then the fuel difficulty would arise again. How empty the East River looked without any craft on it. It was rather a charming little waterway in its own right, though nothing to compare with the stately Hudson. The water scintillated in the sunshine, and the air was clear and fresh, for no factories had spewed fumes and smoke into it for many years. There were few gulls, for nothing was left for the scavenger. Those remaining were forced to make an honest living by catching fish. In Manhattan, where the buildings had been more soundly constructed, the signs of abandonment were less evident. Empty streets, an occasional cracked window. Not even an unusual amount of dirt, because in the past the normal activities of an industrial and ruggedly individual city had provided more grime than years of neglect could ever hope to equal. No, it would take Manhattan longer to go back than Long Island. Perhaps that too would not happen during his lifetime. Yet, after all, when he reached Fifth Avenue, he found that Central Park had burst its boundaries. 59th Street was already half jungle, and the lush growth spilled down the avenues and spread raggedly out into the side streets, pushing its way up through the cracks it had made in the surface of the roads. Although the plaza fountain had not flowed for centuries, water had collected in the leaf-choked basin from the last rain, and a group of grey squirrels were gathered around it, shrilly disputing possession with some starlings. Except for the occasional cry of a cat in the distance, these voices were all that he heard, the only sound. Not even the sudden blast of a jet regaining power. He would never hear that again. Never hear the stridor of a human voice piercing with anger, the cacophony of 100 television sets each playing a different program, the hoot of a horn, off-key singing, the thin, uncertain notes of an amateur musician. These would never be heard on Earth again. He sent the car gliding slowly, no more traffic rules, down Fifth Avenue. The buildings here also were well built. They were many centuries old and would probably last as many more. The shop windows were empty except for tangles of dust, an occasional broken, discarded mannequin. In some instances, the glass had already cracked or fallen out. Since there were no children to throw stones, however, others might last indefinitely, carefully glassing in nothingness. Doors stood open, and he could see rows of empty counters and barren shelves fuzzed high with the dust of the years since a customer had approached them. Cats sedately walked up and down the avenue or sat genteelly with tails tucked in on the steps of the cathedral, as if the place had been theirs all along. Dusk was falling. Tonight, for the first time in centuries, the street lamps would not go on. Undoubtedly, when it grew dark, he would see ghosts. But they would be the ghosts of the past, and he had made his peace with the past long since. It was the present and the future with which he had not come to terms. And now there would be no present, no past, no future, but all merged into one, and he was the only one. At 42nd Street, pigeons fluttered thickly around the public library, fat as ever, their numbers greater, their appetites grosser. The ancient library, he knew, had changed little inside. Stacks and shelves would still be packed thick with reading matter. Books are bulky, so only the rare editions had been taken beyond the stars. The rest had been microfilmed, and their originals left to Johnson and decay. It was his library now, and he had all the time in the world to read all the books in the world, for there were more than he could possibly read in the years that, even at the most generous estimate, were left to him. He had been wondering where to make his permanent residence, for with the whole world his, he would be a fool to confine himself to some modest dwelling. Now he fancied it might be a good idea to move right into the library. Very few places in Manhattan could boast a garden of their own. He stopped the car to stare thoughtfully at the little park behind the grimy monument to neoclassicism. Like Central Park, Bryant had already slipped its boundaries and encroached upon 6th Avenue, Avenue of the World, the street signs said now, and before that it had been Avenue of the Nations and Avenue of the Americas. But to the public, it had always been 6th Avenue, and to Johnson, the last man on earth, it was 6th Avenue. He'd live in the library, while he stayed in New York, that was. He'd thought that in a few weeks, when it got really hot, he might strike north. He had always meant to spend a summer in Canada. His surface car would probably never last the trip, but the Museum of Ancient Vehicles had been glad to bestow half a dozen of the bicycles from their exhibits upon him. After all, he was, in effect, a museum piece himself, and so as worth preserving as the bicycles. Moreover, bicycles are difficult to pack for an interstellar trip. With reasonable care, these might last him his lifetime. But he had to have a permanent residence somewhere, and the library was an elegant and commodious dwelling, centrally located. New York would have to be his headquarters, for all the possessions he had carefully amassed and collected and begged, and, since money would do him no good anymore, bought, were here. And there were by far too many of them to be transported to any really distant location. He loved to own things. He was by no means an advocate of Rousseau's complete return to nature. Whatever civilization had left that he could use without compromise, he would, and thankfully. There would be no electricity, of course, but he had provided himself with flashlights and bulbs and batteries, not too many of the last, of course, because they'd grow stale. However, he'd also laid in plenty of candles and a vast supply of matches. Tins of food and concentrates and synthetics, packages of seeds should he grow tired of all these and want to try growing his own. Fruit, he knew, would be growing wild soon enough. Vitamins and medicines. Of course, were he to get really ill or get hurt in some way, it might be the end. But that was something he wouldn't think of, something that couldn't possibly happen to him. For his relaxation, he had an antique hand-wound phonograph, together with thousands of old-fashioned records. And then, of course, he had the whole planet, the whole world to amuse him. He even had provided himself with a heat-ray gun and a substantial supply of ammunition, although he couldn't imagine himself ever killing an animal for food. It was squeamishness that stood in his way, rather than any ethical considerations, although he did indeed believe that every creature had the right to live. Nonetheless, there was the possibility that the craving for fresh meat might change his mind for him. Besides, although hostile animals had long been gone from this part of the world, the only animals would be birds and squirrels, and further up the Hudson, rabbits and chipmunks and deer, perhaps an occasional bear in the mountains. Who knew what harmless life form might become a threat now that its development would be left unchecked? A cat sitting atop one of the stately stone lions outside the library met his eye with such a steady gaze of understanding, though not of sympathy, that he found himself needing to repeat the by now almost magic phrase to himself. Not in my lifetime, anyway. Would some intelligent life form develop to supplant man? Or would the planet revert to a primeval state of mindless innocence? He would never know, and he didn't really care. No point in speculating over unanswerable questions. He settled back luxuriously on the worn cushions of his car. Even so little as 20 years before, it would have been impossible for him, for anyone, to stop his vehicle in the middle of 42nd Street and 5th Avenue purely to meditate. But it was his domain now. He could go in the wrong direction on one-way streets, stop wherever he pleased, drive as fast or as slowly as he would, and could, of course. If he wanted to do anything as vulgar as spit in the street, he could, but they were his streets now, not to be sullied. Cross the roads without waiting for the lights to change? It would be a long, long wait if he did. Go to sleep when he wanted, eat as many meals as he wanted whenever he chose. He could go naked in hot weather, and there'd be no one to raise an eyebrow. Deface public buildings, except that they were private buildings now, his buildings. Idle without the guilty feeling that there was always something better he could and should be doing, even if there were not. There would be no more guilty feelings. Without people and their knowledge, there was no more guilt. A flash of movement in the bushes behind the library caught his eye. Surely that couldn't be a fawn in Bryant Park. So soon? He thought it would be another 10 years at least before the wild animals came sniffing timidly along the Hudson, venturing a little further each time they saw no sign of their age-old enemy. But probably the deer was only his imagination. He would investigate further after he had moved into the library. Perhaps a higher building than the library. But then he would have to climb too many flights of stairs. The elevators wouldn't be working. Silly of him to forget that. There were a lot of steps outside the library, too. It would be a chore to get his bicycles up those steps. Then he smiled to himself. Robinson Crusoe would have been glad to have had bicycles and steps and such relatively harmless animals as bears to worry about. No, Robinson Crusoe never had it so good as he, Johnson, would have, and what more could he want? For whoever before in history had had his dreams, and what was wrong with dreams after all, so completely gratified? What child envisioning a desert island all his own could imagine that his island would be the whole world? Together, Johnson and the earth would grow young again. No, the stars were for others. Johnson was not the first man in history who had wanted the earth, but he had been the first man, and probably the last, who had actually been given it. And he was well content with his bargain. There was plenty of room for the bears, too. If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button to help the channel grow and thrive. Thanks. The Big Engine by Fritz Leiber. Narrated by William Skye. Have you found out about the big engine? It's all around us, you know. Can't you hear it even now? There are all sorts of screwy theories, the professor said, of what makes the wheels of the world go round. There's a boy in Chicago who thinks we're all of us just the thoughts of a green cat. When the green cat dies, we'll all puff to nothing like smoke. There's a man in the West who thinks all women are witches and run the world by conjure magic. There's a man in the East who believes all rich people belong to a secret society that's a lot tighter and tougher than the mafia, and that has a monopoly of power secrets and pleasure secrets other people don't dream exist. Me, I think the wheels of the world just go. I decided that 40 years ago, and I've never since seen or heard or read anything to make me change my mind. I was a stoker on a lake boat then, the professor continued, delicately sipping smoke from his long, thin cigarette. I was as stupid as they make them, but I liked to think. Whenever I'd get a chance, I'd go to one of the big libraries and make them get me all sorts of books. That was how guys started calling me the professor. I'd get books on philosophy, metaphysics, science, even religion. I'd read them and try to figure out the world. What was it all about anyway? Why was I here? What was the point in the whole business of getting born and working and dying? What was the use of it? Why'd it have to go on and on? And why'd it have to be so complicated? Why all the building and tearing down? Why'd there have to be cities with crowded streets and horse cars and cable cars and electric cars and big open work steel boxes built to the sky to be hung with stone and wood? My closest friend got killed falling off one of those steel box kites. Shouldn't there be some simpler way of doing it all? Why did things have to be so mixed up that a man like myself couldn't have a single clear, decent thought? More than that, why weren't people a real part of the world? Why didn't they show more honest-to-God response? When you slept with a woman, why was it something you had and she didn't? Why, when you went to a prize fight, were the bruisers only so much meat and the crowd a lot of little screaming popinjays? Why was a war nothing but blather and blow up and bother? Why'd everybody have to go through their whole lives so dead, doing everything so methodical and prissy like a Sunday school picnic or an orphan's parade? And then, when I was reading one of the science books, it came to me. The answer was all there, printed out plain to see, only nobody saw it. It was just this: nobody was really alive. Back of other people's foreheads, there weren't any real thoughts or minds or love or fear to explain things. The whole universe, stars and men and dirt and worms and atoms, the whole shooting match, was just one great big engine. It didn't take mind or life or anything else to run the engine. It just ran. Now, one thing about science: it doesn't lie. Those men who wrote those science books that showed me the answer, they had no more minds than anybody else. Just darkness in their brains, but because they were machines built to use science, they couldn't help but get the right answers. They were like the electric brains they've got now, but hadn't then, that give out the right answer when you feed in the question. I'd like to feed in the question, "What's life?" to one of those machines and see what came out. Just figures, I suppose. I read somewhere that if 1 billion monkeys had typewriters and kept pecking away at them, they'd eventually turn out all the Encyclopedia Britannica in trillions and trillions of years. Well, they've done it all right, and in jig time. They're doing it now. A lot of philosophy and psychology books I worked through really fit in beautifully. There was Watson's behaviorism, telling how we needn't even assume that people are conscious to explain their actions. There was Leiber's monadology, with its theory that we're all of us lonely atoms that are completely out of touch and don't affect each other in the slightest, but only seem to, because all our little clockwork motors were started at the same time in pre-established harmony. We seem to be responding to each other, but actually we're just a bunch of wooden-minded puppets. Jerk one puppet up into the flies, and the others go on acting as if exactly nothing at all had happened. So there it was, all laid out for me, the professor went on, carefully pinching out the end of his cigarette. That was why there was no honest-to-God response in people. They were machines. The fighters were machines made for fighting. The people that watched them were machines for stamping and screaming and swearing. The bankers had banking cogs in their bellies, the crooks had crooked cams. A woman was just a loving machine, all nicely adjusted to give you a good time, sometimes, but the farthest star was nearer to you than the mind behind that mouth you kissed. See what I mean? People just machines set to do a certain job and then quietly rust away. If you kept on being the machine you were supposed to be, well and good. Then your actions fitted with other people's. But if you didn't, if you started doing something else, then the others didn't respond. They just went on doing what was called for. It wouldn't matter what you did, they'd just go on making the motions they were set to make. They might be set to make love, and you might decide you wanted to fight. They'd go on making love while you fought them. Or it might happen the other way. Seems to, more often. Or somebody might be talking about Edison, and you'd happen to say something about Ingersoll, but he'd just go on talking about Edison. You were all alone. Except for a few others, not more than 1 in 100,000, I guess, who wake up and figure things out. And they mostly go crazy and run themselves to death or else turn mean. Mostly they turn mean. They get a cheap little kick out of pushing things around that can't push back. All over the world you find them, little gangs of 3 or 4, half a dozen, who've waked up but just to their cheap kicks. Maybe it's a couple of coppers in Frisco, a schoolteacher in KC, some artists in New York, some rich kids in Florida, some undertakers in London, who found that all the people walking around are just dead folk and to be treated no decenter, who see how bad things are and get their fun out of making it a little worse. Just a mean little bit worse. They don't dare to destroy in a big way because they know the machine feeds them and tends them, and because they're always scared they'd be noticed by gangs like themselves and wiped out. They haven't the guts to really wreck the whole shebang. But they get a kick out of scribbling their dirty pictures on it, out of meddling and messing with it. I've seen some of their fun, as they call it, sometimes hidden away, sometimes in the open streets. You've seen a clerk dressing a figure in a store window? Well, suppose he slapped its face. Suppose a kid stuck pins in a calico pussycat, or threw pepper in the eyes of a doll. No decent live man would have anything to do with nickel sadism or dime paranoia like that. He'd either go back to his place in the machine and act out the part set for him, or else he'd hide away like me and live as quiet as he could, not stirring things up. Like a mouse in a dynamo or an ant in an atomics plant. The professor went to the window and opened it, letting the sour old smoke out and the noises of the city in. "Listen," he said. "Listen to the great mechanical symphony, the big black combo. The airplanes are the double bass. Have you noticed how you can always hear one nowadays? When one walks out of the sky, another walks in. Presses and pumps round out the bass section. Listen to them rumble and thump. Tonight they've got an old steam locomotive helping. Maybe they're giving a benefit show for the old duffer. Cars and traffic, they're the strings. Mostly cellos and violas. They purr and wail and whine and keep trying to get out of their section. Brasses? To me, the steel on steel of streetcars and L-trains always sounds like trumpets and cornets. Strident, metallic, fiery cold. Hear that siren way off? It's a clarinet. The ship horns are tubas, the diesel horn's an oboe. And that lovely, dreadful French horn is an electric saw cutting down the last tree. But what a percussion section they've got. The big stuff like streetcar bells jangling is easy to catch, but you have to really listen to get the subtleties. The buzz of a defective neon sign, the click of a stoplight changing. Sometimes you do get human voices, I'll admit, but they're not like they are in Beethoven's Ninth or Holst's Planets. There's the real sound of the universe, the professor concluded, shutting the window. That's your heavenly choir. That's the music of the spheres the old alchemists kept listening for. If they'd just stayed around a little longer, they'd have all been deafened by it. Oh, to think that Schopenhauer was bothered by the crack of carters' whips. And now it's time for this mouse to tuck himself in his nest in the dynamo. Good night, gentlemen. Hang Head, Vandal, by Mark Clifton. Narrated by William Skye. Arrogantly, they set out to destroy a planet for the good of man. Man who is stuffed with straw where his heart and mind and soul should be. On our abandoned Martian landing field, there hangs a man's discarded spacesuit, suspended from the desensitized prongs of the Come to Me tower. It is stuffed with straw, filched, no doubt, from packaging cases which brought out so many more delicate, sensitive precision instruments than we take back. None knows which of our departing crew hanged the spacesuit there, nor exactly what he meant in the act. A scarecrow to frighten all others away? More likely a mere Kilroy was here symbol, defacing initials irresistibly carved in a priceless ancient work of art saying, "I am too shoddy a specimen to create anything of worth, but I can deface. And this proves I too have been." Or was it symbolic suicide, a sense of guilt so overpowering that man has hanged himself in effigy upon the scene of his crime? Captain Layton saw it there on the morning of final departure, saw it and felt a sudden flush of his usual stern discipline surge within him, all but formed the harsh command to take that thing down at once. "Find the one who hanged it there! Bring him to me!" The anger, the command, died together, unspoken. Something in the pose of the stuffed effigy hanging there must have got down through to the diminishing person inside the ever-thickening rind of a commander. The forlorn sadness, the dejection, and yes, he too must have felt the shame, the guilt which overwhelmed us all. Whether the helmet had fallen forward of its own weight because the Vandal had been careless in stuffing it with too little straw to hold its head erect, Vandals being characteristically futile even in their vandalism, or whether instead of supposed Vandal this was the talent of a consummate artist moulding steel and rubber, plastic and straw into an expression of how we all felt. No matter, the result was there. The captain did not command the effigy be taken down. No others offered, nor asked if that might be his wish, not even the ubiquitous ensign perpetually bucking for approval. So, on an abandoned Martian landing field, there hangs a discarded spacesuit, the image of man stuffed with straw where heart and mind and soul was intended to be. At the time, it seemed a most logical solution to an almost impossible problem. Dr. Van Dam summed it up in his memorable speech before the United Nations. If he were visually conscious of the vault of face blurs in the hushed assembly, this lesser sight did not obscure his stronger vision of the greater vaulted mass of shining stars in black of space. He may not even have been conscious of political realities which ever obscure man's dreams. First, what he said would be weighed by each delegate in terms of personal advantage to be gained for his own status. Second, his words must be weighed again in terms of national interest. Third, what advantage could be squeezed out for their racial religious colour block? At the fourth level of consideration, what advantage to the small nation block over the large, or how would it enhance the special privileges of the large over the small? Down at the fifth level, could it preserve the status quo, changing nothing so that those in power could remain in power, while at the same time giving the illusion of progress to confound the ever-clamouring liberals? At the deep sixth level, if one ever got down that far, one might give a small fleeting thought to what might be good for mankind. If Dr. Van Dam even knew that such political realities must ever take precedence over the dreams of science, he gave no sign of it. It was as if all his thought was upon the glory of the stars and the dream of man reaching out to them. It was with the goal of reaching the stars in mind that he spoke. "We must sum up the problem," he was saying. "It is simply this. There is a limit to how far we can theorize in science without testing those theories to see if they will work. Sooner or later, the theorist must submit himself into the hands of the engineer whose acid test of worth is simply this: does it work? We have always known that the Roman candles we are using for our timid little space flights can take us only to the nearest planets, for there is that inexorable ratio of time to initial thrust, that unless thrust continues and continues, the Mayfly lifetime of man will expire many times over before we could reach the nearest star. Nor will our limited resources fuel ion engines, and we must learn how to replenish with space dust gathered along the way. To have continuous velocity, we must have continuous nuclear power. To have continuous nuclear power, we must have more nuclear tests. Now we believe we know how to take not special ores but ordinary matter of any kind and convert it into nuclear power. We believe we can control this. We have this in theory, but the engineer has not tested it with his question, does it work? We cannot make these tests on Earth, for what if it does not work? We dare not use the moon. Its lighter gravity makes it too valuable a piece of real estate in terms of future star journeys. It will be our busy landing stage. We dare not contaminate it nor risk destroying it. We have reached stalemate. On Earth and Moon we can go no farther without testing. On Earth and Moon we dare not test. Some other testing area must be found. Our explorers have brought us conclusive proof that Mars is a dead world. A useless world in terms of life. Useless, too, as a source of minerals, for our little Roman candles can carry no commercial payload. A useless world for colonization, with air too tenuous for human lungs and water too scarce for growing food. Humans must be housed in sealed chambers or constantly wear spacesuits. From all practical points of view, a worthless world. But invaluable to science. For there, without destroying anything of value to man, we can put our theories to test. We believe we can start a nuclear reaction in ordinary rock and dirt and keep it under control to produce a continuous flow of power. We believe we can keep it from running wild out of control. If the innumerable tests we must run do contaminate the planet or even destroy it slowly, our gain in knowledge will be greater than the loss of this worthless real estate. There was a stir in the assembly, something between a gasp of horror and admiration at the audacity of man sacrificing a whole planet to his knowledge. They had not known we were so far along the way. And then, on second thought, a settling back in satisfaction. It seemed a simple solution to an impossible problem. To take not only Vandal's tests away from Earth, but all nuclear testing of every kind. To quell the fears and still the clamouring of the humanists who would rather see man stagnate in ignorance than risk the future to learn. At every level of political reality, this might turn to advantage. If there were any who still thought in such terms, it might even be good for mankind generally. I am not mystic-minded, Vandal continued when the rustle and murmur had diminished. But the convenience of this particular planet, located precisely where it is, far enough away that we must have made great progress in science to reach it, and close enough to be ready when we need it for further progress, this seems almost mystical in its coincidence. That for the ones who would have to go through the usual motions of obtaining higher power approval for doing what they fully intended doing all along. My question. Shall the nations of Earth agree upon our use of this so convenient and otherwise worthless, ready-at-hand stage placed right where we need it, waiting for us down through all the ages until we should be ready to make use of it? Their ultimate response was favourable. Dr. Vandal did not mention, and being only politicians unable to see beyond the next vote or appointment, they did not ask, True, we do have a theory of how to start and continue the slow-burn nuclear conversion of ordinary rock and dirt to energy. What we do not have, as yet, is a way to stop it. We think that eventually future man will probably find a way to stop the process. We think slow burn will not speed up and run out of control to consume an entire planet before we have found a way to stop it. We think that future science may even find a way to decontaminate the planet. We hope these things. But we know that the science of nucleonics will be stillborn and stunted to grow no farther unless we go on testing. We convince ourselves that even if an entire planet is consumed, it is a worthless planet anyway, and will be worth it. Yet there was the usual small minority who questioned our right to destroy one of the planets of the solar system. There is always such a minority, and as always the rest of the world, intent on turning what it intended to do anyway into the right thing to do, was able to shout them down. Anyway, the consequences were for future man to face. Or so we thought. I say we because I was one of the members of Project Slow Burn. Not that I'm the hero. There wasn't any hero. Mistaken or not, it was conceived this wasn't one of those television spectaculars cooked up to convert science into public emotionalism. There was no countrywide search for special photogenic hero types to front the project. The reporters, true to their writing tradition of trying to reduce even the most profound scientific achievement to the lowest common denominator of sloppy sentimentalism or avid sensationalism, tried to heroize Dr. Vandal as head of the science side of the project. But he wasn't having any. Don't you think, gentlemen, he answered them with acid scorn, it is about time the public grew up enough to support the search for knowledge because we need it, rather than because they'd like to go to bed with some handsome brainless kook you've built up into a hero? This response was not likely to further the cause of journalism. They tried to lionize Captain Leighton as head of the transport side of it, but his remarks were even more unprintable. They never got down far enough through the echelons of status to reach me. I was chief of communications, which is just another way of saying I was a television repairman with headaches. Not that it would have done them any good. There isn't one thing about me that fits the sentimental notions of what a hero should be. I'm not even a colourful character. If I'm expert in my job, it's only because I learned early what any lazy man with an ounce of brains also learns, that life goes easier for the expert than for the ignorant. Which is not exactly the hero attitude the public likes to hear, but true all the same. I did have an advantage which qualifies me to tell this tale. Supervision, nowadays, sits on its duff in an office surrounded by television monitors showing them every phase of their responsibilities, and punches buttons when some guy tries to goof off or starts lousing up the operation. Somebody has to maintain the system and check the same monitors. I saw everything of importance that happened. That's the only way I come into the yarn at all. I didn't start out a hero type. I didn't turn into one. I just watched what happened, and I got sick at my stomach along with everybody else. And now I slink away, sick and ashamed, and not understanding even that along with the rest. Not heroes, no, none of us. From the first, this was intended and conducted as a genuine scientific project, a group effort with each man's ego subdued and blended in to serve the needs of the whole. No special heroes emerging to show up the rest of the dopes. None of the usual stuff of romantic fiction was supposed to happen, those unusual dangers, horrible accidents, sudden frightful emergencies so dear to the little sadistic hearts of readers and viewers. So far as I know, nobody beat up anybody with their fists, nor gunned them down, which is the usual, almost the only fictional way yet found among the humanists for coping with life problems. We assembled the master ship on the moon base from parts which were Roman candled up a few pieces at a time from too heavily gravitied Earth. The yelps of pain from taxpayers reached almost as high. It was one thing to wash the hands of the vexing problem of nuclear testing by wanting it shifted out to Mars. It was something else to pay for having it. Against the moon's lighter gravity, we eventually were spaceborne with no more than the usual fight between power thrust and inertia, both physical and psychological. Without touching that precious reserve of fuel which we hoped would bring us back again, we were able to build up enough speed that it took us only a month to reach Mars. No point in showing, because nobody would care, how the 24 of us were cramped in the tiny spaces left by the equipment and instruments we had to carry. Construction and maintenance had done their job properly, and for once inspection had actually done its job too. We were able to reverse properly at the right time, and soft cushion powered our way down into a Martian plain eastward of a low range of hills. Surely everybody has watched the documentaries long enough to have some idea about the incredibly hostile surface of Mars, the too thin air which lets some stars shine through even in daytime, the waterless desert, the extremes of temperature, the desolation. Ah, the desolation. The terrifying desolation. Moon surface is bad enough, but at least there is the great ball of Earth seeming so near in that airless world that one has the illusion of being able to reach out and almost touch it, touch home. No home is still there. Imagine he can almost see it. See that little tip of land there on the east coast of the North American continent? That's where I live. Yeah, somebody answers. And who is that guy walking through your front door without knocking while you're away? Sometimes it seems that close. On Mars, Earth is just another bright spot in the black night sky, so far away that the first reaction is one of terrible despair, the overpowering conviction that in all that vast hostility a man will never more see home, nor know again the balmy twilight of soft, moist summer, nor feel the arms of love. Explorers had not lied. Nothing anywhere could be more worthless to man than the planet Mars. Worthless except for the unique purpose which had brought us there. We dug in beneath the surface. Now, surely again, everyone has seen enough of the documentaries that it is unnecessary to show us digging out our living quarters and laboratories beneath that merciless plain. We used the displaced powdered rock to form a crude cement, not long-lasting but adequate for the time we would be there. With it we surfaced over our living area. This was not so much to provide a landing field, since most of our journeying would be in individual jet-powered spacesuits, but to help ensure against any leakage of air if our inner seals cracked. To help seal out the killing radiation we intended to let loose, that too. We erected come-to-me towers at each elevator which would lower spacesuited men to lower levels where they could go through locks to reach their quarters. One come-to-me tower for each half-dozen men turned to the power source of their suits to bring each man safely back as truly as a homing pigeon, to guarantee against becoming lost on that hostile planet, and in emergency, should one arise, to see that no panic mob ganged up at one lock and died waiting there for entrance to safety while other locks remained idle, the human way of doing things under stress. We had to finish all that in the first few weeks before any nuclear tests could be started. Anybody whose notions of science are derived from white-frocked actors in television commercials hasn't the vaguest idea of how much back-breaking physical work at the common labour level a genuine scientist has to do. There was some emotional relief once we had dug in and sealed out the awful desolation of an uncaring universe. This is the hardest part of reconciling oneself to the science attitude. More comforting to believe even that the universe is hostile than to admit that it simply doesn't care about man one way or another. In our sealed quarters, we might briefly imagine ourselves working in an air-conditioned laboratory back home. It helped. It certainly helped. Not that I seemed to find time for more than exhausted sleeping there. To see what would be going on at the various field sites where tests were to be run meant the cameras had to be installed at those spots. In spite of the purported rigid tests for expedition personnel, my two assistants must have been somebody's nephews. Somehow each installation seemed to require I be there. Be there, and usually without some little piece of equipment which would have helped so much but which had been deleted from the lists we submitted by clerks who were more concerned with making a big showing on how much weight they could eliminate than in helping us. Somehow we managed. But I have made a little list of guys I'm going to ferret out and poke in the nose once I get back to Earth. Maybe those Hollywood producers who think the only way to solve a problem is to beat up somebody or gun him down have something after all. Right on top of that list, in big bold letters, is the spacesuit designer who thinks a man can handle the incredibly fine parts of miniaturized electronic equipment with those crude instruments they give us to screw into the arm ends of spacesuits. Somehow we managed. Somehow out of chaos order came. Somehow tests got made. Sometimes the theories worked. Sometimes, more often, there was only the human sigh, the gulp, the shrug, and back to the drawing board. Big surprise at the end of the first 3 months. A supply ship landed. Mostly food and some champagne yet. Stuff the folks back home thought they'd like to have if they were out there. Even some pin-up pictures, as if we weren't already having enough trouble without being reminded. But none of the equipment we'd radioed for in case the taxpayers could forego a drink and a cigarette apiece to raise money for sending it. The public couldn't understand our need for equipment, so they didn't send any. Miracles aren't supposed to need any equipment or effort, they just come into being because people want them. The packages of home-baked cookies were welcome enough after our diet of hydroponic algae, but I'd still rather have had a handful of miniature transistors. Some of the guys said they'd have been willing to substitute their cookies for an equal weight of big buxom blonde, but that's something the cookie bakers probably preferred not to think about. The little 3-man crew of the supply ship, as they were taking off for their return journey, promised they'd tell 'em what we really wanted when they got back, but I doubt the message ever got broadcast over the home and family television sets. Anyway, scientists are supposed to be cold, unfeeling, inhuman creatures who wander around looking noble, wise, and above it all. In the beginning, I thought that once I got the heavy work of installation completed, I could do a little wandering around looking wise and noble myself. No such luck. I'd no more than get set up to show one experiment than it was over, and I'd have to dismantle, move, and set up for another. We thought the lighter gravity of Mars, 38%, would make the labour easy. But somehow there was still lifting, tugging, pulling, hauling, cursing. But then nobody wants to hear how the scientist has to work to get his miracle. The whole essence is the illusion that miracles can be had without work, that all one needs is to wish. All right, so we'll get to the miracle. Now we were finally ready to get down to the real test, the main reason for our coming out to Mars, Project Slow Burn. Vandal chose a little pocket at the centre of that little cluster of hills to our west, that little cluster of hills everybody has seen in the pictures radioed back to Earth. We didn't know it at the time, but that little cluster of hills was causing quite an uproar among archaeologists back home. No archaeologist had been included in the expedition, and now they were beating their breasts that from the pictures those hills looked mighty artificial to them. There was too much of a hint that the hills might once have been pyramids, they said, incredibly ancient, perhaps weathered down eons ago when the planet was younger before it had lost so much of its atmosphere, but maybe still containing something beneath them. We didn't hear the uproar, of course. Administration deemed it unnecessary for us to bother our pretty little heads about such nonsense. In fact, the uproar never got outside the academic cloister to reach the public at all. Administration should have listened. But then, when does man listen to what might interfere with his plans to spoil something? We got all set to go in that little pocket at the centre of the hills. The spot was ideal for us because the hill elevations gave us opportunity to place our cameras on their top to focus down into the crater we hoped would appear. A whole ring of cameras was demanded, as if the physicists shared too much of the public's attitude, and all I needed to produce enough equipment was to wish for it. But by stripping the stuff from virtually every other project, I managed to balance the demands of the slow burn crew against the outraged screams of the side issue scientists. Vandal's theories worked. At first, it took the instruments to detect that there was any activity, but gradually even crude human eyes could see there was a hole beginning to appear, deepen, and spread progressively. It was out of my line, but the general idea seemed to be that only one molecular layer at a time was affected, and that, in turn, activated the next beneath and to the side while its own electrons and protons gave up their final energy. The experiment did not work perfectly. The process should have been complete. There should have been no byproduct of smoke and fire, no sign to human eyes of anything happening except a slowly deepening and spreading hole in the ground. Instead, there was some waste of improperly consumed molecules resulting in an increasingly heavy fire-laced smoke, which arose sluggishly in the thin air, borne aloft only by its heat, funneling briefly while it gave up that heat, then to settle down and contaminate everything it touched. To compound my troubles, of course. The physicists were griping their guts out because I didn't have the proper infrared equipment to penetrate the smoke, and somehow I wasn't smart enough to snap my fingers and abracadabra produce. Those damned cookie packages instead of equipment. Those damned clerks who had decided what we wouldn't need. My little list was getting longer. Still, I guess I was able to get a feeble little snap from my fingers. I did manage to convert some stuff, never intended for that purpose, into infrared penetration. We managed to see down into that smoke and fire-filled crater. To see enough. It was the middle of a morning. Somebody who still cared claimed it would be a Tuesday back home, some 3 basic weeks after beginning the experiment. The hole was now some 30 feet across and equally deep, growing faster than Vandal's figures predicted it should, but still not running wild and out of control. Even if it had been, we couldn't have stopped it. We didn't know how. I was trying to work out a little cleaner fix on the south wall of the crater when that wall disappeared like the side of a soap bubble. My focus was sharp enough to see down and into that huge vaulted room. To see the living Martians in that room shrivel, blacken, writhe, and die. To see some priceless alien works of art writhe and blacken and curl, some burst into flame, some shatter into dust. That was when the scientists, sitting there watching their monitors with horror-stricken eyes, felt jubilation replaced with terrible guilt. I too. For naturally I was watching the master monitors to see that the equipment kept working. I saw it all. I saw those miniature people, yes, people, whole and beautiful, in one brief instant blacken, writhe, and die. Out of the billions of gross people on Earth, once in a generation a tiny midget is born and matures to adult of such perfection in proportion and surpassing beauty that the huge, coarse, normal person can only stare and marvel, and remember the delicate perfection of that miniature being with nostalgic yearning for the rest of his life. From such, perhaps, comes the legends common to all people in all ages of the fairies. Or, eons ago, was there traffic between Earth and Mars? Or even original colonization from Mars to Earth, finally mutating into giants? They were people, miniatures of ourselves. I saw them there. Perhaps not more than a dozen in that room. But in other rooms? Perhaps in a lacework of underground rooms. A whole civilization which, like ourselves on Mars, had gone underground, sealed themselves in against the thinning atmosphere, the dying planet. And we had begun the atomic destruction of their planet. We had begun it. We could not stop it. The corrosion keeps growing, spreading. I saw them die. Somehow I felt their pain. But I did not die of it. I carry it with me. I shall always carry it with me. That's all there is. In years to come, people on Earth, people who did not see what we saw, did not feel the pain and guilt we felt, will wonder at our behavior following that. Oh, there is much to wonder. If there is a civilization, where does their food come from? If they are able to convert rock to food, why are they not able to stop the atomic destruction of their planet we have started? If they are able to so fill us with their own grief for what we have done that we can think of nothing but to slink away like whipped curs caught in vandalism, why didn't they do this before we started the fire we cannot stop? Oh, there is so much unanswered. People will wonder that we simply abandoned most of our equipment, the very project itself, that for a sick hour we watched them, then, with one accord, without anybody making the decision, we began to withdraw and start for home. Like small boys thinking only to vandalize a schoolhouse in their savage glee, discovering it is a shrine. Or, perhaps in time, we can rationalize it all away. Perhaps so soon as during that long journey back. It wasn't our fault, we shall begin to say. They were as much to blame as we. Sure they were. More to blame. They were more to blame than we. Why didn't they come out of their holes and fight us? With their fists if they didn't have any guns. Any red-blooded Amuri, well, whatever they are, ought to have enough guts to come out and fight to defend home, flag and mother. We'll probably get around to that. It's the normal attitude to take after vandalism. It's the human way. But as of now, our only thought is to slink away. On our abandoned Martian landing field, there hangs a man's discarded spacesuit suspended from the desensitized prongs of a come-to-me tower. It is stuffed with straw filched, no doubt, from packing cases which brought out so many more delicate, sensitive precision instruments than we take back. Although we have not been entirely irresponsible in our headlong flight back home. We do bring back some of what we took out, the more valuable of the instruments. We have been most selective in this. The only coarse, insensitive, unfinished instrument we bring back is man. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these stories, make sure to hit the like button to help the channel, and check out the rest of the channel for hundreds more narrations. And a reminder that you can get more over on my Substack, which is linked in the description, along with some of the Amazon and Audible narrations I've done. See you in the next one.